Hi guys, history lovers, most importantly, History 43 students. Uh, Going to talk about the independence of Mexico today, 1810 to 1821. But we need to do a lot of background information material. Got to set up a lot of things to sort of put everything in motion, put things in place to sort of make sense of exactly how the independence of Mexico comes about. So, in order to do that, let's begin by talking about the House of Habsburg and the sad and problematic life of Carlos II. So let's start like so. From the 1400s to the 1800s, the aristocratic House of Habsburg in Europe produced rulers of an enormous number of countries. This is not even a complete list, but Portugal, Ireland, Croatia, Hungary, England, Germany, Mexico, not to mention the Spanish, Russian, and French empires, among others, clearly placing first by a country mile ahead of any Kennedys, Bushes, or Clintons that one might care to mention in terms of, being around a little too long. The scions of this family almost exclusively married one another, and when not intermarrying, married into a relatively small group of European noble families referred to as blue bloods due to their pale skin and highly visible veins. No, they were not Chicago cops nor vampires. They just didn't get out into the sun a lot to do a lot of work, to get a tan. Very pale. They also had a high distribution of Rh negative and type O blood, which only about 5% of the world's population possesses. So as a result of this, all of these centuries of inbreeding meant that by the 1700s, they had developed a very distinctive look. Okay, what you see over here in this portrait of Carlos of Spain. And this look was known as mandibular prognathism, but commonly referred to as the Habsburg jaw. This long and prominent kind of lantern jaw, oftentimes accompanied by very prominent protuberant lips and a long kind of overhanging nose. It was an unfortunate abnormality that had developed as a result of the genetic bingo games that they'd been playing with all of this marrying of relatives throughout the centuries, and again, resulting in the distinctively deformed eyes, nose, and jaw that you see here. Carlos was born in 1661 and was, in the words of a decidedly unsympathetic contemporary, a genetic monstrosity. He was unable to walk until the age of 8, and even then he could not get about without assistance, nor could he talk until the age of 4, and all of his life he was nearly unintelligible except to those who knew him best. His tongue was so large that he drooled almost constantly, and he was unable to chew his food for himself. He had to have his food mashed up into a kind of paste, like baby food, basically, so that he could sort of get it down, not chew it, because he couldn't chew it. Sometimes he even had food chewed for him by certain people. We won't get into that because I don't even know enough about it to get into it, and I wouldn't even like to speculate on it because, quite frankly, it sounds too gross to speculate upon. But at any rate, Carlos, not a happy life, right? Now, in 1679, Carlos was married to the granddaughter of the King of France, Louis XIV, with the thought being that tying or connecting the fortunes of the waning power of the Spanish Empire to the waxing power of the Empire of France, this could be nothing but good for both parties, both empires. Unfortunately, Carlos was unable to consummate the marriage, seal the deal, right? Such was the concern over whether or not he would be able to father an heir to the Spanish throne that several of the leading powers of Europe had spies planted within the palace to inspect the king's undergarments to try and determine whether or not he was fertile. I mean, literally, the kings of other countries had people inspecting Carlos's underwear, looking for evidence of semen, pre-seminal fluid. They were trying to figure out if he was going to be able to impregnate his queen to produce an heir to the Spanish Empire because it was of the utmost importance to the governments of other European nations as to whether or not there would actually be a legitimate union between France and Spain. If he couldn't produce a child and so actually connect France and Spain, I mean, the marriage wasn't good enough. He had to produce an heir to the throne, okay? Everyone was concerned here. Louis XIV, the Sun King, was the most warlike of all European monarchs. He was like Godzilla on the European stage, okay? And if he had control of the power and the fortune, the might of the Spanish Empire, as well as the power of France as well, and could wield that double power, let's say, in terms of pushing the aggressive agenda of France, well, this was enough to have the other powers of Europe quaking in their boots. So when I say that their interest as to whether or not Carlos could actually produce an heir to the throne, was of the utmost importance to their sort of national security, believe me, they were concerned. That's why they were spying on his underwear, and sending reports back home as to whether or not it looked like, the kid was going to be able to get the job done, okay? Now, at any rate, Carlos fathered no child with his first wife, nor even with his second wife. And when he died, to make a really long story short, there was a seriously confused line of succession in terms of defining who would become the next king of Spain and emperor of the Spanish Empire. Most importantly, every government in Europe, other than France, knew one thing damn good and well, and that was that no matter how long and how loudly Louis XIV argued his case, there was no way in hell they were going to let him, Louis, the most aggressive and warmongering king in memory, put his son, Louis, Dauphin, or Prince of France, on the throne of Spain, even though he actually had the best genealogical claim. Remember, all of these families, these royal families, were all intermarried and connected to one another. Okay? So, no way, no how, wasn't going to happen. That would, in effect, again, as I was just saying, make Louis XIV the king of France and Spain, master of both their global empires, and put him in prime position to go to war against and possibly take over all of Europe. Okay, but Louis said, oh yes it is man, Louis and my sons, the Dauphins, the lineage of his mother. And everyone said, no way. And Louis said, then this means war. And so war it was. The War of the Spanish Succession from 1701 to 1715. Practically all of Europe, just about every damn country in Europe, dogpiled on France and Spain. Okay? It was like Godzilla and one of the other monsters against everybody else in those old Japanese monster movies. I think there was one of those movies. I think it was called Destroy All Monsters. Wasn't that one? Like Godzilla against everybody? Anyway, at the end of it, 15 years of war, the nations of Europe were exhausted. Okay? But the Franco-Spanish alliance had been defeated. Louis lost. His ridiculously long reign, 72 years the dude was king. He became king when he was 5 years old. Okay? He was done. Right at the end of the war, he died. Like literally a couple of months away from the end of the damn thing, he was done. He croaked. Okay? Supposedly, his final words were, perhaps I love the war too much. And he was done. Okay? Ironically, at the end of all of this, France got Spain after all. Okay? Louis's grandson, the Duke of Anjou, he renounced his claim on the French throne, gave it up forever, signed off on a paper, said, I will never, ever become the king of France. Okay? And so he became Philip V of Spain, king of Spain. So the crowns of Europe said, okay, we can live with this as long as you're just going to be the Spanish king and you're never going to be the French king as well. Okay, so France and Spain, not formally bound together under one power, meaning the Louis power, right? And him, Louis, the Sun King, dead in his grave. Okay, right, they're fine. So Europe relaxed, took a deep breath, okay, right, exhaled, and they looked forward to what they hoped would be an era of peace and prosperity after such a protracted and bloody period of war, 15 long years of war. And in fact, that last like 50 years had been war, because Louis was a war-loving dude, man. So they hoped that they would have a good long 20, 30, 40 years of peace, right? Okay, well, whatever. Pardon me, guys. I'm getting over, like, I got a bad virus. Now, this new Spanish king, Philip, found himself in very dire straits. Because now that he was on the inside of Spanish power, looking out, so to speak, now that he's the king in Spain, things were every bit as grim as he had suspected, and as every nation in Europe had suspected for quite some time. Spain was crushingly, blindingly, heartbreakingly bankrupt, just stone dead financially. But how could this be? When she'd had all of the wealth of the Indies, right, of the Americas in her possession for some 200 years. I mean, come on, guys. The Aztec Empire, the gold, the silver, all that wealth. The Incan Empire, the gold, the silver, all that wealth. And all the other wealth of the Americas. 200 years of more riches than anybody could believe. How could she be bankrupt? Well, first off, financing almost completely on her own the endless and costly wars of the Counter-Reformation of the Catholic Church had not been the brightest financial idea of them all. Disastrous financial idea. I mean, the worst economic idea in the history of ideas, but whatever. That was one of their disastrous moves. It also didn't help matters that in the same year that Columbus had sailed the ocean blue, right, back in 1492, in that same year the Jews had been expelled from Spain. The Spanish government decided to kick all the Jews out of their country, also having to do with religious matters, okay? And when those Jews left the Kingdom of Spain, they took their intelligence, education, and skills to France, England, and the Netherlands, countries that were, particularly England and the Netherlands, primarily Protestant countries, thus greatly diminishing Spain and vastly enriching those countries with human capital. They had, after all, held the majority of the most prominent positions in trade and banking, the Jews. The crown had also come up with preposterous solutions to raise revenues in mad attempts to pay off their debts. The Hidalguía, I said that terribly, the Hidalguía, or the nobility, were completely exempt from all forms of taxation. The wealthiest people in Spain paid no taxes. Zero. None at all. And by the 1600s, 1 out of every 7 Spaniards had been elevated to the ranks of the nobility. They were Hidalgos, okay? And it was not just the nobility, but the clergy, the military, and anyone who held a governmental office who paid no taxes. And this accounted for 25% of the male population. Stop and think about this, guys. Imagine if 25% of the full-grown, hard-working American male population paid no income tax whatsoever. Okay? These ill-conceived decisions, and dozens of other ones besides, had helped to bleed the empire dry. And it was now the responsibility of this new French king, who was now the King of Spain, and his A-team of financial advisors to try to right this sinking ship and restore Spain's ancient glory. to try to undo 200 years of economic mismanagement. Think about our problematic financial situation in the United States right now. We're just trying to figure out how to undo 20 years or so of bad economic decision making. They got 200 years of problems to try to unravel. How? How are they going to do this? Okay, I'm glad you asked. The Bourbon reforms was how. Okay, Bourbon. Bourbon. Get your voice up in your nose. You got to speak like a Frenchman. The Bourbon reforms. Bourbon. That's the last name of this French king. Philippe Vengeance. His last name was Bourbon. Philippe Bourbon. The Bourbon kings. He was the first of these French kings of Spain, the Bourbon kings. So the Bourbon reforms were a series of reforms to replace the old and over-regulated Spanish system, the Spanish way of doing things, with a new French-style, streamlined system way of doing things, intended to politically and economically modernize Spain and her colonies, decentralize decision-making, while also reducing the power of the Creole elite so as to stem or reduce any possibility of colonial rebellion. Throw the Criollos a bone by giving their sons better appointments in the military, hope that this would assuage their irritation over the sons' better appointments in the military, and hope this and hope that this would assuage their irritation over the sons of the Peninsulars getting the better positions in the government and the houses of trade, reduce the power and influence of the church, develop manufacturing, and introduce technological innovation. Get all of this done, and the 18 believed that the Spanish Empire would get its act together. Now, they needed quick money to pay off debts. The government forced the church to call in loans, mortgages, all lines of credit. Then they wanted the church to turn that wealth over to the crown, which in turn would then pay the church back that money on low-interest, long-term loans. They also sold off large tracts of public lands. These were not actually just public lands. They were lands that belonged to the Indians, thus angering the Indians. All of the wealth lost by the Criollo elite when they lost their church-backed financing was in turn milked in one way or another from the lower classes. Okay, stop and think about this. Remember who the Criollos are, guys. These are the people that control the lands, right? They own the big ranches. They own the big areas of land where they cultivate crops, right? Okay, they control all of the lower class workers, and they use them to work for them, okay? When the church pulls in all of their loans and lines of credit and mortgages, the Criollos are going to lose lots and lots of money. Okay, so where are they going to get that money from? In all kinds of different ways. They're going to get it by squeezing the lower class people even harder and in all kinds of different and creative ways to try to get the money back that they're losing. So this leads to the revolts of the masses. Between 1730 and 1780, over the course of 50 years, there are 128 lower class rebellions throughout Latin America, okay? Or Spanish America, more specifically, because Latin America would include Brazil, and we're not talking about Brazil. We're talking about the Spanish American colonies, okay? So not just New Spain, Nueva España, soon to become Mexico. We're talking about in all the Spanish American colonies because they're all being treated the same way by the Bourbon reforms. It's happening throughout areas that are soon going to be known as, you know, new countries called Ecuador, Colombia, Bolivia, Peru, Argentina, Chile. Okay, it's not just Mexico. All parts of Spanish America, the exact same things are happening. So 128 lower class rebellions as the poor are being squeezed by the Criollo elites at the top. The poor rebel. Okay, 128 rebellions in 50 years. But the colonial governments manage all of this. They brought in the money, they paid down the debt, they put down the uprisings, and they straightened things out, okay, to a degree. Now, let's step away from all of this for a moment, and let's consider the relationship between the Criollos and the Peninsulars. In 1790, the statue of Coatlicue and the Sunstone, which you see here, and you'll remember from previous lectures, were dug up during construction under the Zócalo near the cathedral, and, although they didn't know it then, near the ruins of the Templo Mayor of Huitzilopochtli. The initial reaction of non-Indians to these great stone icons, okay, was largely the creeps. The same reaction of the Spanish at the time of the conquest, 270 years earlier. In other words, they dug these things up out of the ground, they threw buckets of water on them, they cleaned them all off, and especially the statue of Coatlicue, the non-Indian reaction was, Satan, get behind me, right? Crossing themselves, right? Good, what the hell is this, right? I mean, it was the same reaction. It was like, this is like something devilish, something evil, something from the pits of hell, right? They don't like this kind of thing. Christians looking at this, horrible, okay? Now, on the other hand, the Indians in Mexico City began to gather around these things day after day after day and stand staring at them for minutes and then hours, just looking at them. And then they began to place candles and flowers on them, but especially Coatlicue. And soon Indians from the surrounding countryside began to come to do the same. And from further away and further away, making pilgrimages to see this stone effigy, Coatlicue, of a time and place that they knew nothing about, of an ancestry and a heritage that they could not consciously remember. But somewhere, deep down in their racial soup of Jungian archetypes, swimming around in the depths of their ancient humanity, they knew who she was. And they could do nothing less than pay their mother obeisance, right? Think about it. It had been almost 300 years since they had seen any kind of an image of any of these ancient pre-Columbian gods. But somehow they knew who this was. Well, after a couple of weeks of this, the Spanish authorities, they were no dummies. And they got nervous. They could see that something was happening here. And having just made it through 50 years of lower class rebellion, scary rebelliousness, right? Okay, they sort of looked at each other and said, you know, we got to get this thing the hell out of here. Like this thing might stir up some kind of real rebellion or some kind of, you know, we got to do something about this. And so they did. Under cover of darkness, they brought in ox carts in the middle of the night. And the logistics of this are completely beyond me, but somehow they moved Coatlicue. That statue weighs 24 tons, okay? They moved it overnight to a pit that they had dug ahead of time. They had it all set up, man, like a big grave at the University of Mexico, where Indians didn't go, right? There were no Indians at the University of Mexico. That was for middle-class people, right? You know, Spaniards, okay? They also had a pit ready right there for the Sunstone. They buried them hidden away under cover of darkness, and they stayed buried there from the 1790s until the 1920s after the Mexican Revolution, which is when they were discovered. That paperwork was found totally accidentally in an archive in Mexico City. It's like, what? They're where? And they dug them up, brought them back forth into the warming rays of Tonatilla for a grateful world to bear witness to what it was that the ancient Aztecs had taken for granted on a day-to-day basis, right? The beauty of those ancient Aztec sculptures. They were set up in the 1920s in the museum, the National Museum of Anthropology, and that's where they are today. 100 years later, you should go down there and check them out, guys. That museum is one of the great museums. And, you know, if you think about planet Earth having a universal museum of mankind, like if all of our museums sort of sum up as a kind of museum of man, then the National Museum of Anthropology and Archaeology in Mexico City is one of the greatest chambers in that museum. It's a mind-boggling food for the soul. I urge you to go and dig it at some point before you die. But anyway, okay, now to continue. Before these two great stone icons were hidden away from public view, they had one last effective inspiration, aside from that of reminding the Indians of central Mexico on some level of the greatness from which they were descended, and that was to help to further convince the Criollos that they were, in some important way, connected to those who had wrought so magnificently in stone. You will recall that the Criollos were the descendants of those original conquistadors and settlers who had arrived between 1519 and the mid-1940s, and as such had been in control of the economic engine of the colony for the last 250 years. The great landed estates with their herds of livestock and production of all manner of crops. Control of the Indian workers through the repartimiento and the hacienda systems. The mining works, the factorias. The only major aspect of the economic life of the colony not in the hands of the Criollo elite, and a fact that was deeply resented by them, was the import and export industry, which was controlled by the Peninsulars. The Criollos were also keenly resentful of the fact that all of the positions of real prestige and power within the government were held by Peninsulars, as well as the highest offices in the Catholic Church. The sons of the Criollos were allowed some high rank within the colonial military, but, weak as it was, this was a small reward for what they considered to be their and their ancestors' great service to the crown. The Criollos saw themselves as a cheated people, because from their point of view, the only reason there even was a colony of Nueva España was due to the tremendous risks taken by their ancestors. The great wealth and prestige won for Spain and her king was a direct result of the strength, courage, and resolve of Criollo force of arms in the 1500s, when the Aztecs and other Indian kingdoms had to be conquered. It was only after that the colony could be built. And what was the reward that was given to the Criollos for their brave efforts? Second-rate positions in government and the church. They were lorded over by those late arrival Peninsulars coming from Spain after everything was safe and secure for them. As T.E. Fehrenbach put it, doors opened for the poorest clerk out of Sevilla that remained closed to families that had been 200 years in Mexico. The resentment of the Criollos toward the Peninsulars had grown over these 250 years to terrific dimensions, to the point where they blamed them for all of their misfortunes. Not the king, no. It wasn't His Majesty's fault that the laws in the colony mistreated the Criollos. The laws passed by the king were good laws. It was the way that the Peninsular governmental administrators in Nueva España administrated the laws. That was what was bad. That was what was wrong with everything. So when the Criollos saw those two great stone icons standing up in the sunlight in the Zócalo in Mexico City, they were also inspired as well. Inspired to remember with greater excitement and intensity than ever before in all of the last 250 years, that they were the descendants of conquistadors, and that none of this colony would even exist if it were not for the men whose blood flowed through their veins. Powerful stuff, right? It made them re-examine all of the injustices and mistreatment that had been heaped upon them by the peninsular government in Mexico City. And they would even begin to think of themselves as Americans and of the peninsulars as Spaniards, as an unconscious way of further separating themselves from the governors of the colony. And over the next few years, leading up to that so important revolutionary year of 1810, these criollos would mutter amongst themselves and grumble and talk and begin to plan and even plot. And ultimately, all of this would lead, albeit incidentally, to the independence of Mexico. But before we get to that, a little more backstory. And look, sorry if it's wearying for you. I know you want to get to the independence of Mexico, but we're almost there. It has to be done. So just hang in there, okay? Now, between 1803 and 1815, you had Europe caught up in an epic struggle, remembered as the Napoleonic Wars, which revolved around a little bitty, short Corsican general over here on the far right, Napoleon, the great god Napoleon. It was after he became a big shot. Tremendous painting by Jacques-Louis David. Okay, little Corsican general who had, through a combination of talent, brains, and tremendous ambition, risen to the level of the Emperor of France, who was now striving to bring all of Europe under his control. In spring in 1805, a popular rebellion broke out against King Carlos IV at the bottom here. And this culminated in a plot by Ferdinand of Asturias, the Prince of Spain, at the top, to overthrow his father. The conspiracy failed, and shortly thereafter, when it became clear to his father that the people preferred the idea of his son as king, Carlos abdicated the throne and left the country for exile in Italy. But Napoleon preferred the idea of his own nephew, Joseph Bonaparte, on the throne. Should be in Spain, a little typo there, my apologies. Because in that year, 1807, Napoleon was particularly aggravated over Portugal's alliance. Here's Portugal, okay? Here's France, and Spain is in between. Napoleon was particularly aggravated over Portugal's alliance with England, and wishing to attack Portugal by land, but needing a way through Spain to do so, he liked the notion of a totally compliant Spain next door to France that would be, in effect, ruled by him, but through his nephew. So, after installing his nephew at the head of the Spanish government and with the approval of the Spanish nobility, he imprisoned Ferdinand VII in France for the next 6 years and immediately had to occupy Spain with a greater and ever greater military force because the people of Spain, rising up in outrage over what they saw, quite rightly, as a totally illegitimate government being imposed upon them, rebelled against Joseph Bonaparte's rule, and for the next 6 years, Spain would be plunged into what would become known as the Peninsular War of 1808 to 1814. Okay? Now, pardon me, guys. And again, because you still don't trust me, I know you're going, okay, all right, but what's this got to do with the independence of Mexico, cabrón? Well, here's the deal, ya see? How did the colonists see all of this? For their part, there was great loyalty in New Spain to and love of King Carlos IV, but not a lot of knowledge of this Ferdinand, the son, okay? And no affection at all for this Bonaparte, this nephew of Napoleon, this Frenchman. But what they definitely saw in 1808 was opportunity. The criollos were not the only ones who were frustrated in Nueva España. The peninsulars had their own frustrations as well. They thought that many of the Bourbon reforms, fresh and modern as they were, did not really apply to the realities of their colony. of New Spain, and that there were changes that needed to be made that could only be made by those who lived and worked and made decisions within the colony. For all of the promises of decentralization that had been made for the last century, not as much of that had happened as had been promised. And so the Peninsular and Criollo elites set up on a plan. They began to talk about setting themselves apart a little bit from the authority of Spain by issuing a statement to the effect that until the Spanish government was once again under the rightful authority of Ferdinand, who's in prison in France at this time, if you recall, then we will not obey any edict or law issued by the government of Spain. In other words, it was almost like they were declaring independence, but that's not what they were doing. I want to stress that to you guys. I want you to understand that. They're not declaring independence. If Ferdinand or Carlos had been put back on the throne the very next day, they would have been loyal, back in the game, 100%. Okay? They were simply saying, we will not obey the orders of this illegitimate French king. And oh yeah, in the meantime, we're going to change a lot of stuff more to the way we want it to be, under the hope that once a legitimate government is back in power, Carlos or Ferdinand, they'll see that the government in the colony has made a lot of really smart moves, and everything will be cool. All will be well. This has been referred to as the Mask of Ferdinand by historians, as it was not that they were so loyal to Ferdinand per se, it's just that they used that as a pose to get out of obeying the government of Bonaparte, so that they could set about doing what they wanted to do with more autonomy, more home rule on their own in the colony. They put on a mask of loyalty to Ferdinand so they could do what they wanted to. It was just a way of doing what they wanted to, wearing this mask of loyalty. Okay? Now, we're getting to the good stuff. The independence of Mexico. 1809-10. It's a little, some historians say the independence of Mexico really began in 1809. Most historians say no, 1810. I'm putting 9-10 there just so you guys understand that it's kind of debatable as to when it really began. 1810 is usually the best year to go with, but okay. The beginning of all this, Hidalgo's spark. On September 16th, 1809, nervous that the Criollo elite might proclaim an autonomous government without them, Peninsular elites in Mexico proclaimed an independent government, and shortly thereafter, the Audiencia, which is like the Supreme Court in the Americas, basically, for Spain. They met and approved of this, and the Criollo leadership were left to grumble and mutter some more about the unfairness of the situation. But in Querétaro, northwest of Mexico City, Capitan Don Ignacio Allende, who you see up here in the corner of the screen, a military officer in the Bourbon organized standing army, arranged a regular meeting of like-minded Criollo elites to discuss the affairs of the day, the irritations of the Peninsular elites' abuses, and the notions of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, maybe that rings a bell, as well as liberty, fraternity, and equality. That comes from the French Revolution, which they saw as really only applying to elites like themselves. But anyway, they're sitting around and they're talking about big ideas that have to do with, you know, independence, that sort of thing, right? Now, one of their main topics of conversation was the notion of how the army might respond if led against this new peninsular government. Among these Criollo conspirators was a priest, Miguel Hidalgo y Costilla, a tall, gaunt fellow with a fringe of white hair and piercing green eyes. Hidalgo was of the best tradition when it came to the priesthood, in that he became a priest because of a legitimate desire to help people in the name of God, out of a love of humanity. Perhaps Hidalgo had too much love in his heart, for he had been banished from his parish in Mexico City because of his looseness with the bottle, like to tip it a bit, as well as with women. And he had ended up in the small town of Dolores, near Querétaro, like 100 miles, a little bit more northwest of Mexico City. He had also been banished because he was a bit too fond of injecting into his sermons foreign ideas about the reform of government, religion, and society. In other words, he wasn't the most strict-minded and orthodox and conservative sort of Catholic priest. He was kind of a free thinker, okay? Now, out in this small town in Dolores, for the first time in his life, outside of the big city, he saw the reality of the rural poor, of the campesinos and the indios, who were, of course, 90% or more of his parishioners. Now, Hidalgo may have, tipped the bottle a bit and played a bit with the ladies, but still, he loved humanity, and he determined to try and improve the lives of the people in his parish by helping them to develop grape, olive, and silkworm cultivation on public lands so that they could work on their off days from the haciendas to earn extra income and better their lives, make extra money, right? But no, this was against the law, and when it was discovered that they weren't doing this, he had to stand by and watch in dismay as the authorities came, tore out the plantings, burned down their cultivations, destroyed all the hard work of he and his people. And it was frustration over this sort of reality that led Hidalgo to join in on Allende's conspiracy. But from the very beginning, he disagreed with one essential premise in their conversations: that any success that they might enjoy would not rest on the strength of the regular army, but on the strength of the people. Allende and the others believed in a revolt by the army. Only Hidalgo believed that a revolt would succeed if it was fueled by the strength of the masses, of the common people. Okay, now, by the middle of 1810, approximately 3,000 people in the Bajío district, which is the area where Querétaro is located, knew of the conspiracy. Partly because Allende worked so hard at trying to convert members of the army by talking to people and telling them, hey, we want to try to do this, Now, 3,000 people, that's not a conspiracy. That's like, a secret that's not a secret, right? Inevitably, word of all of this leaked to the government of Mexico City. This led to the assigning of a military force to be sent to arrest the conspirators. But this sort of thing, of course, takes time to be set in motion, and word of these plans got out and back to Querétaro, to the ear of the corregidor Miguel Dominguez, whose wife, Josefa Ortiz de Dominguez, was a liberal firebrand and a passionate believer in Hidalgo's notion of the empowerment of the people. Okay, here she is. She got her picture on money, right? That's always a sign that you were a big deal in the history of your country. When they put your picture on the money, you were somebody, right? Okay, now, she got word to identify. Her husband was so freaked out that she would do something that might get them in trouble that he locked her in her room, but she got word to one of her maids, and ultimately the word got to Hidalgo. She snuck word to him, right? So, right on Josefa, okay? So, Allende gets the word. Allende gets to Hidalgo. He gets to his place at 2 in the morning, okay? When he told them what happened, Hidalgo gets up, gets dressed, puts a pistol in his belt, and turns to Allende and says, well, the only thing to do now is to go hunting gachopines. Okay, gachopines was a derogatory term coined by the Creoles to describe peninsulars that essentially meant tender feet or soft feet, those who have to wear shoes because their feet are too soft to take the rocks and cactus of America. Okay, or in other words, Spaniards, pinche Spaniards with their little baby soft feet. Let's go kill these mothers. In other words, let's kick ass and take some names, baby, right? So Hidalgo is going to war. Now, the next day is Sunday, the morning of September 16th, 1 year to the day that the peninsular government had been declared. Hidalgo rang the bell to call the faithful in for the Mass. No one knows exactly what the content of his sermon was that day. What we do know is that speaking to a church filled mainly with poor and ignorant Indians and castas, he did not speak in terms of independence and nationhood, because these are not terms that would have meant anything to those people. We do know that he spoke in the terms that did mean something to them. He spoke of the Gachopines planning to give the church over to the new king and the heretic Joseph Bonaparte, and that the people had to rally behind Ferdinand VII to destroy the traitors now in control of their government, the Gachopines, right? He also talked about the 3 centuries of cruel and abusive rule of the peninsular government, of the inhuman treatment of the people, and of the torture, slavery, and rape, and of the degradation and murder, terrible typo. But to say that he talked is a misnomer, because in fact he shouted, he raised the roof, and he brought down the thunder and lightning in the apocalyptic language of the Lord. And as he did so, the people, like a pressure cooker, turned up to 10, and then finally bursting after too much steam is built up, they exploded. All of them. And not just the hundreds in the church itself, but the thousands massed outside at the doors that had gathered around the church, and the windows and beyond, all of them in one great inhuman scream of mingled frustration, resentment, pain, and rage. El grito de Dolores, the cry that shook New Spain and marked the true beginning of the war for the independence of Mexico. This was when and where it all began. Hidalgo culminated the Mass by shouting, "Viva el Rey! Viva America! Muere el mal gobierno! Mueran las Gachopines!" Long live the king! Long live America! Death to bad government! And death to the Gachopines! Okay? And the people screaming, charged out of the church and off into the night to rally up more people and bring more. And by the next day, there was a mass, a mob, more and more and more people, okay? Sorry about the quality of this image, guys. It's a little grainy. I wish it was better, but it was the best resolution I could get. It's a detail of a big mural by Juan O'Gorman called Hidalgo Leads the People. You can see him, right, rallying up the people and the torch of liberty and everybody rallying up. Here's Allende in the background with his sword, and you get the idea, right? Okay, now, Hidalgo left the church. The people followed him. At Atotenilco, there was a roadside shrine to the Virgin, and Hidalgo took the banner with her portrait that hung there and fastened it to his staff, while everyone fell to their knees and sobbed as he shouted, "Viva la Virgen de Guadalupe!" thus co-opting Mexico's own Holy Mother into the struggle on the side of the people. The mob proceeded to the town of San Miguel, where Allende was quick to place a battalion of his old regiment at the head of things, or at least he tried to, because even as this was going on, the mob, thousands strong now, began to loot and pillage first the businesses of the townsfolk and then the homes of the people. And this is where it became clear right from the start that Allende's notion of a Criollo elite-led insurgency and Hidalgo's reality of a lower-class revolution were not going to coexist in any sort of easy way. Within a week, Hidalgo had 12,000 men in his army. They had looted enough businesses, homes, and estates to be armed, dressed in all manner of stolen finery, eating like kings. Hidalgo gave Allende no military control and styled himself Captain General of America. This is the banner of Guadalupe that Hidalgo had fastened to the staff. Okay, it's in a museum in Mexico. Mexico City today. Now, they marched on the mining district of Guanajuato, knowing that to strike a blow there would be crippling for the colony and a great victory for their insurgency. Let me stop for a minute here, guys, and orient you with the map, okay? Here's Mexico City, all right? Here is Querétaro, all right? Here is Dolores, Hidalgo. That's what it's called today, renamed after Father Hidalgo. It used to be just Dolores, okay? And here is Guanajuato, okay? So they've basically marched from here down to here, all right? Now, the local Spaniards withdrew with their valuables into a huge stone government granary, a storehouse for grain called the Alhóndiga de Granaditas, all right? Now, this is that granary today, okay? Big stone storehouse for grain, which in a pinch could be turned into like a fortress, basically. There had been enough time to dig trenches outside and set cannons on the walls. Hidalgo's men suffered terrific losses attacking the walls until this gigantic miner, picture this, man, is this big giant guy, El Pipila. He took up a huge flagstone on his back, okay, this gigantic piece of stone, okay, with a torch and a can of kerosene. He ran in close to the door, splashed the kerosene on it, and lit the door on fire. I'm going to think about what happens to a log in your fireplace, right? When you have a fire at Christmas, once it's all burned out, it becomes brittle, right? It's like charcoal. Once the door was burned into like charcoal, then they could all charge in and kick the door into pieces. Hidalgo's men charge in there, kick the door to pieces. They go in. When the people realize that there's no way to stop the mob from storming in, they throw all their gold and jewels out the windows up here at the top to sort of try to stop the mob from coming in, but they don't care. All the people are slaughtered. Okay, just does no good. There's this tremendous bloodshed. And then to the horror of the movement's leadership, including Hidalgo, you know, the miners, they released the miners from the mines, okay? Thousands and thousands of miners that have been treated, you know, in the most inhumane way imaginable. Then they join in with the army. And the whole town is treated to this horrific mass bloodbath of looting and killing, so grim that reports of it, after they spread far and wide, they result in Hidalgo and his entire army being excommunicated by the church leadership in many towns and cities throughout New Spain. It's just this like horror pornography. I mean, like kind of a, like just, you know, you read these accounts of history of like the gutters of the streets running red with blood kind of thing. It's like, it's grim, really horrible. Look at this amazing monument to El Pipila. Like, here's the size of people. There's this tremendous statue to the dude charged in into that rock. Like, unbelievable. You know, on the one hand, it's like, wow, what an awesome sort of hero. But on the other hand, he helped to enable this bloodbath. That's, you know, one of these horribly complicated sort of moments in history where you don't really know who the good guys are, who the bad guys are. But at any rate, pardon me, guys. Okay, now, okay, Hidalgo's got this even much larger army now. He faces a serious problem by mid-October. The whole thing's been going on at this point by like 4 or 5 weeks. Because by this time, most of the larger towns and cities in the northern part of the colony, they have declared their support for his movement. But the church is opposed to him. And even within his own army, his co-conspirators, Allende and his fellow military officers, they're frustrated because they have no real power except to direct regiments during specific battles. The rest of the time, they're just like along for the ride. Hidalgo believed, rightly, that they would not support a true social revolution in favor of the people, but no number of untrained Indians and castas would, in the end, be able to defeat disciplined military forces, which they have not faced up to this point. For that, he needed the abilities of Allende and his men, and the loyalty they could possibly still command amongst the members of the regular army that they can maybe bring over to their side. By the end of October, Hidalgo has resolved to attack Mexico City from the west. There are only 30,000 army personnel defending it. 23,000 of these men had inexplicably been sent north to defend San Luis Potosi, leaving only 7,000 men in Mexico City. And Hidalgo's got something like, at this point, 80,000 guys, okay? So Hidalgo approaches Mexico City from the west and crushes the 7,000 defenders, okay? He's literally within sight of Mexico City. I mean, it's visible from the mountains, or the foothills coming down out of the mountains into the Valley of Mexico. They can see the city. It's right there. They stop and wait. They sit. Within a day, a half a day, like 6-8 hours away or something, and they just look at the city and wait and wait. And Hidalgo waits. Why? There it was in front of him, the very symbol and identity of 300 years of colonial rule and the oppression of the people. Why did he not seize it then and there? He hesitated for 3 days and finally turned his army of 80,000 away to the north on the road to Querétaro. Why did he do this? To save his men? The city? All of the innocent people to be found there? Perhaps finally that man within him that had made him the priest that he was became too sick, if only for a moment, of the prospect of so much bloodshed, of another Guanajuato, but on a far more horrific scale? Certainly we will never truly know the answer to that question. At any rate, his army heading north was intercepted by the return from San Luis Potosi of General Callejas and his 23,000 men. Now these are army personnel, okay? Hidalgo's army is nearly destroyed, certainly dismembered. Allende and his Creole allies fled to Querétaro. Hidalgo and a sizable force escaped to distant Guadalajara, where they were able to rebuild themselves into a solid force of resistance, 7,000 strong. But many thousands more were either killed, captured, or fled into the hills and forests to try and make their way back to their homes and families, wondering all the while, at least in my mind I see this, why they had left in the first place and what they had hoped to accomplish. Now let's look at this for a minute here, guys. Think about what I was just talking about. They came from Guanajuato down to the south, attacked Mexico City, or didn't, almost did, right? Decided to go north from there, back towards Querétaro, hang on a minute, which is this way, okay? Somewhere up in here, were intercepted by Callejas, crushed, okay? Allende and his guys ended up going up this way. Hidalgo escapes all the way up to Guadalajara, where he forms up with 7,000 men, okay, and ultimately is joined by Allende and the guys that he had with him. Now, within a matter of months, Hidalgo had gathered to him another volunteer army of approximately, again, something like 80,000 men. General Callejas was sent out for Mexico City in 1811 with a large army and orders to deal with the rebels using whatever means necessary. Hidalgo's volunteer forces proved to be no match for trained military personnel in formal battles. And slowly but surely, the fortunes of war turned against Hidalgo and his men, and they were forced to retreat towards the north. Finally, a desperate plan formed in the mind of Allende. He, his primary officers, and Hidalgo would seek military assistance from the government of the United States in the form of financial aid to purchase weapons. After all, would not the First Republic of the Western Hemisphere lend a hand to a younger brother in need who was also attempting to throw off the colonial yoke? So they decided to ride north to seek this assistance, but in doing so, they were betrayed in Coahuila by a Creole captain who held a grudge against Allende for having refused to appoint him to the rank of lieutenant general years before. They were arrested and turned over to the government. All of the military officers were taken to Chihuahua, the location of the nearest military court, tried for and found guilty of treason, and shot. Hidalgo was a slightly different matter, for as a priest, he had to be handled by the ecclesiastical authorities. He was taken to Mexico City and imprisoned for 3 months, during which time he was questioned intensely, but treated well. From this time comes one famous line: "Pardon is for criminals, not for the defenders of the country," as well as one written retraction of his revolution, which many Mexican historians believe was created under duress, or possibly even forged. On July 30th, 1811, he was shot by firing squad, and an Indian was paid 20 pieces of silver to strike off his head with a sword. It was taken, along with the heads of Allende, Aldama, and Jimenez, and hung in an iron cage from the walls of the Alhóndiga de Granaditas, where it remained for many, many years. Hidalgo. Look at that wonderful sculpture somebody created of him. Now, it may seem that at this point all was lost, but such was not the case. Although Callejas was in the north, energetically crushing all resistance in the areas that had declared loyalty to Hidalgo, throughout central and southern New Spain, wildfire rebellions had broken out since the Grito, and now they threatened to grow larger. Of these localized warlords, the most important was José María Morelos, a casta of mixed Indian, African, and Spanish blood who, at age 25, after years of saving every penny he earned, entered the priesthood for an education and studied under Father Hidalgo in Mexico City. Morelos was barely 5 feet tall and suffered from the after effects of malaria, which gave him blinding migraines. He countered these by wrapping links of water-soaked cloth tightly around his head to crush the pain. Upon hearing of the Grito, he went to Dolores and joined his old mentor, and Hidalgo sent him to Michoacán to raise the people there against the government. Father Morelos found that thousands in his old parish were ready to follow him, but he would only take those men who had a weapon and knew how to use it. So he started with just 25 men, but by the end of 1811, he commanded more than 9,000 well-armed, trained fighters, and he controlled most of the region of Morelos, an area that later would be named after him. At the time it wasn't called Morelos, but anyway. By the fall of 1813, Morelos had largely paralyzed the government and had control of the modern states, there's an unfortunate typo, my apologies, of Morelos, Michoacán, Guerrero, Oaxaca, Puebla, and Veracruz. He collected taxes, appointed government officials, enforced an insurgent law, and operated as a virtual benign dictator. By this time, Morelos had determined that it was time to stop talking about an ongoing rebellion and start talking about the creation of a republic, and so he summoned the Congress of Anahuac and the mountains of above Acapulco, inviting 8 delegates from the areas under his control, and there he laid out the Sentimientos de Nación. In this document, it said, sovereignty should be established in the people. Government should be administered by separate branches, probably 3 being best. Government should moderate the extremes between wealthy and poor through a redistribution of wealth. There should be racial equality. There should be universal voting rights. Political office should be open to all citizens regardless of social rank or caste. There should be an abolition of tithing to the church. There should be an abolition of special privileges for the church and military. Large land holdings should be redistributed by the government, with half of the seized land going to the landless poor and half to support the expenses of the government. Interesting stuff, right? The first few there should remind you of, I don't know, like the United States Constitution. But then you can also see that some of this later stuff, far more radical than the U.S. Constitution. And a few of these things are very particular to the situation in Mexico, right? You know, because, for example, the Catholic Church and its great power and privileges, that has no relationship to the American experience. But at any rate, okay. These are the 9 biggest parts of the Sentimientos de Nación. Every one of these ideas was embraced with great enthusiasm by the liberal delegates at the Congress. Unfortunately, the wealthy landowners, the vast majority of the military men, and representatives of the church, hey, they didn't really see things the same way. This was simply too radical, and far too much, and too quickly, and on this latter count, you're probably correct. In addition, the insurgent style of warfare, this rebellion style of warfare, was laying waste to the economy of the country. The roads were blocked, the bridges destroyed, the mines were closed, and many of them were literally blown up and inoperable. The fields were lying vacant. Nothing was being grown in terms of, you know, creating an export trade to bring money in for the economy. The ports were moribund. Nothing was coming in or out of the country. Remember that to begin with, the Criollos in general were opposed to a peninsular government and might have been happy to see some quick transition of power into the hands of men more of their own way of thinking, even if there was a dollop of social revolution in their intellectual DNA. Something had to be done. Through late 1813 and into 1815, for about 2 years, the government expended every effort in retaking the North, eliminating all rebellion there, which had risen again against the government when all the military force had been redirected against Morelos in the south. What this accomplished, Morelos' forces were hit everywhere and decisively. And within a few weeks of determined fighting, all the territory that he had won in 2 years had been lost. And Morelos' forces had vanished back into the valleys and the mountains from which it originally issued. In late 1815, Morelos was captured and executed in Mexico City. This great statue of Morelos, this legendary statue of Morelos in Anitzio in Michoacan. There it is at a distance on a little island in the middle of a lake. Look at the statue just dominates this little island. Pretty awesome. Okay, now, almost done here, guys. Just like 2-3 minutes. Go back to Spain for a minute here. When Ferdinand VII was imprisoned by Napoleon, the liberals came to power under Joseph Bonaparte in Spain, and the new constitution that they wrote was, predictably, one that reflected all the prime liberal ideas of the day, including giving a lot of autonomy to colonial possessions abroad, like New Spain. The exact disposition of these powers pleased the Criollos in New Spain, the Peninsulars, not so much. But 6 years later, when Ferdinand was released in 1814 and returned to power, this constitution was repudiated, and much of what it had accomplished was undone, or at least there was an attempt to undo its reforms. But the world had turned. Things had changed, and for good. In those 6 years, all across South America, Spain's colonies had launched their own wars of independence. The cry of Hidalgo, the grito, had echoed across a great distance, and men like José de San Martín and Simón Bolívar, they had heard it and responded. As Spain's government wrestled around in an attempt to manage its own affairs, it showed precious little ability to manage anything at all across the Atlantic, where the Peninsular and Criollo leaders of its colonies and former colonies had increasingly grown to enjoy the flavor of independent decision-making in their mouths. Spain was certainly not going to admit it yet, and they may not have even realized it, but there was not going to be any putting of the genie back into the bottle And in New Spain, the question that was increasingly on the mind of the leadership of the Catholic Church was this: who is going to come out on top when all of this fighting for power and control is over and done with? The Criollos or the Peninsulars? Because we, the church, we've got to be on the winning side when all of this is said and done, you know? For the church, the issue was the preservation of their ancient power and privileges, not to mention their great wealth and land holdings. And ultimately they decided that Team Criollo, they're going to be the winners. And based on past evidence, having won, they would then reunite the colony under a firm allegiance to Ferdinand VII and Spain. And then the church, having placed their bets on Team Criollo, they decided to try to shape events to ensure that winning outcome. Okay? So with Morelos gone, executed, done, there were still minor warlords operating in various areas of the country. The most potent of them being his devoted right-hand man, Vicente Guerrero, who had an impregnable stronghold in the mountains behind Acapulco that no enemy force would ever successfully assail, although many failed in the attempt. Crushing this resistance would take time, and this process was undertaken primarily by Callejas between 1816 and 1821. But it was late in this period that events in Spain, which I've discussed, overtook those in Mexico and provided the final push that actually precipitated a legitimate declaration of independence for the colony. The decision was made in early 1821 to make a serious campaign against Guerrero and to place a young and successful Criollo officer at the head of it, this cat right here, Agustin de Iturbide. The selection of Iturbide was negotiated with the connivance of church leadership. They maneuvered him into position, believing that Iturbide could beat Guerrero and then, with his victorious army, return, seize control of the capital and the peninsular-dominated government, and right the ship of state. But Iturbide had ideas of his own. He arranged a meeting with Guerrero once he got down into that neck of the woods, okay? And he proposed a 20-point plan to Guerrero that outlined a new future for the colony of New Spain as an independent nation. The plan contained 3 major provisions, which led to it being remembered in Mexican history as the Plan Trigarante, or the Plan of the 3 Guarantees, or more formally in Spanish, it's known as the Plan Iguala. Okay, and the 3 guarantees were that Mexico would become an independent nation. Another bad typo. Many apologies. Mexico would become an independent nation under Ferdinand or some other suitable monarch. The Catholic Church would remain the state religion, and there would be citizenship and racial equality for all Mexicans. Those are the 3 guarantees. And then there's 17 more things in the plan, but we're not going to get into them all. They both understood that even if all 20 provisions could be affected, not every problem would be solved. Okay, but Guerrero seemed to think that, nonetheless, this plan represented major steps towards the nation that Morelos had hoped for, so he accepted this offer from Iturbide. Said, okay, put her there, buddy, right? Okay, now, when negotiations were finished, the 2 generals, they shared the big abrazo, right? Okay, and the story goes that Guerrero said, after all of this tiring talk, men's throats are dry, so let us have a watermelon to quench our thirst. So they brought out this gigantic melon, huge. And Guerrero pulled his sword, offered it to Iturbide, and said, you are the guest, so it is for you to cut the melon. Now, Iturbide knew a macho challenge when he was handed one. So, he really cocked back, and he split the melon with one great whack, big chop. And as the two halves leapt apart, okay, gleaming there for all eyes to see, were the inspiration for the colors of the new Mexican flag. Green for a newly born nation, alive and growing. White for the sacred purity of the Catholic Church that would care for its heart. And red to symbolize the mixed race heritage of the Mexican people and their shared bloodlines of Spaniard, Indian, and African, right? Green, white, and red. Okay, is this a true story? I don't know. But it's a really good story, right? And it's a story, that's the story they tell in Mexico. I don't know if it, went down like that. I wasn't there. But as far as I'm concerned, verdad. Okay, now, word of the plan trigarante spread quickly. The viceroy and his government were outraged but helpless as the overwhelming majority of the people, including the army, supported it. For the government, there was little or no support at all. And so this was the moment of the true birth of Mexican independence. Iturbide would become the first emperor of Mexico, and not long after that, he would be executed as a result of an overthrow of his government. Vicente Guerrero would become president, the first president of Mexico, and not long after that, be executed as a result of the overthrow of his government. Criollos distrusted peninsulars, liberals distrusted conservatives, governments would rise and governments would fall, conflicts would rage, the United States would steal half of Mexico's territory in the 1840s, and there would be no legitimate stability of any kind in Mexico until the dictatorship of Porfirio Diaz in 1876, and that would last for 35 years, and even then, it was only good to be middle class or wealthy in Mexico. For the masses, the great majority of Mexicans, no real justice or aid or assistance of any kind would come their way until the Mexican Revolution of 1910 or 1920. But that is another story for another day and another time. But if you want to dig it, guys, take my History 44 class, and I will tell you all about it. Now, just another 60 seconds and we'll be done. It's a really lovely portrait of Vicente Guerrero by Ramon Sagredo, and a statue of him. My fatherland is first. It's Mi Patria es primero. Great statue of him. Great statue of Father Morelos. I love that dude. I love any great national hero that's only 5 feet tall and suffers from blinding headaches. You gotta love that, right? Great. It's a great portrait of Father Morelos down in Wilmington, California. Just recently restored, actually. This was a photograph I took back in, wow, like 2001, 2002. I haven't even seen it since it was restored, but it looked really good back then. Anyway, there's that. A detail from a mural in East LA of Father Hidalgo with the Torch of Liberty there. And there's Father Hidalgo on his money and Father Morelos on his money in Mexico. And then a painting by the great Jorge Gonzalez Camarena, the creators of the Republic and Senate. You see Allende over here. I'm not sure how these other cats are, actually, to be honest. But I just found that recently and haven't had time to really do any research yet before I put this all together. Here is the Angel of Independence in downtown Mexico City. And having shown you all that, guys, I am out.